Well, this guy, he's a real no-nonsense kind of guy, you know? And you see, there was this flower pot on the brick windowsill of an old tenement building that we're all walking by one day. The bricks are real city, these deep red bricks, almost like copper. And old too, real gritty and weathered. You know, like they've been chipped out with a spike. Some of the bricks had turned white in places, like maybe they were bleached by the sun. I don't know how bricks get that way. The bricks were also pretty uneven in places, like they'd been set crookedly, and so some were jutting out here and there, kind of like the sides of an uneven Lego wall. And around the edges of the windowsill, with the flower pot, there is a coat of like black grime, which seems to create this kind of dichotomy, this, you know, odd juxtaposition, this image of the lone flower pot sitting there on the ledge against a charcoal-stained background. And you know what? It's got a fucking daisy growing out of it. A goddamn Bellus Perennis with its white ray florets shining their way straight up into the city's muck and smoggy skies. So this bastard, who like didn't take shit from anybody, he gets it into his head that, you know, climb up there, and I don't know what he's thinking. Maybe he's gonna shimmy up a drain pipe or something, but this guy, he makes a real effort. He starts like scaling this tenement building. He's got his hand grips, you know, in the nooks between the bricks, and his feet start to dangle at some point, and he's just holding on with his hands. And we're all looking up at him going like, what the fuck, you know, this guy's a nut job. Oh, and another thing I should mention. This guy was all dressed up. You know, black, double-breasted suit, freshly pressed white button-up shirt, tie and a full Windsor, Argyle socks, the whole works. So, he keeps on climbing, going past people's windows, and the flower pot is up on the 5th story of the building, so he's got some real serious climbing to do. He'd get up to one window, set his feet on the brick of the sill, and stretch himself out into the whole window, reaching high up for some hand grips in the brick. Just imagine some dude in his apartment looking out his window to see this well-dressed, urbane rock climber going past. Weird shit, to say the least. So, he's fucking scaling this building. And people down below are starting to take some notice and are stopping to stare up at the guy, who is by this point, like up above the 2nd story window, grabbing onto the stucco and terracotta tile, standing on the head of a frieze of a lion carved into the facade. It was quite something. We were all egging him on, of course. Out in front of the building, a few people were standing by the front gate, which had some really ornate grillwork going on, and they were holding it open and looking up at him. The fire escapes were all rusted, with paint peeling off of the metal in these strip-like slivers, and crumbs of brick were coming down from where he was scraping them off with his shoes from the building's side. Now, the reason he couldn't just climb up those fire escapes was that the flower pot he was trying to climb to was not near the fire escapes. It was about 3 windows down. It was a large building, and the fire escape was attached to the middle of it. The daisy in the flower pot was on a windowsill at the corner of the building. So even if he climbed up the fire escape, he still would have had to like spelunk his way over about 3 windows to his left. Actually, I don't really know why he didn't do that. Maybe he didn't think of it until it was too late. Anyway, he kept right on climbing, slowly but surely, and by the time he got up past the 3rd story, I had a crowd had formed on the street below. Some people, you know, hollering up at him. Folks were starting to poke their heads out of windows in the building, and the buildings across the street. Everyone wanted to see what all this fuss was about. It kind of reminded me of this Norman Rockwell painting I'd seen as a kid in a magazine. I think it was a picture of some soldier coming home from the war, and the whole neighborhood was like hanging out of windows and off of fire escapes, you know, gathering in the street, waving, just stuff like that. But, you know, this no-nonsense rock climber guy, I couldn't believe how much concentration this guy had. He was distracted by none of this. Moving along with these tight, subtle motions, his whole body rigid, every muscle tense. He made his way, inching along, not looking down even once. Just kind of nodding his head a little, hunching his shoulders from time to time, and pulling his body carefully upwards. It was really something. I remember he even sneezed at one point, and everyone watching me below kind of made that hushed, suddenly taking in a breath sound like an all-at-once gasp. But he hung on tight, wiped his nose on his shoulder, and kept right on with it. We were all mightily impressed by this. Well, there really was no turning back for him once he had got up to a certain height. I mean, somebody might have called the cops, and maybe a fire truck would come and extend a ladder up there to get him down. Or some good Samaritan might open up their window for him and let him in, but none of those things seemed likely to happen at the time. At least they hadn't crossed my mind at all. And anyway, he seemed a lot more than a little intent on getting to that flower pot with the daisy in it. Who knows why? Myself? I'd stopped caring why. I was just having too much fun just watching him go after it. I remember he was up by the 4-story window when one of his feet kind of slipped a little. But he recovered nicely, swinging himself around and up a little bit more, trying to get a better grip up there. Now, he probably didn't have on the best footwear for climbing up the side of a building. Not that they make shoes for this express purpose, of course, but his patent leather-soled wingtips would definitely not be recommended for doing any kind of physical activity. Well, apart from walking into a business meeting or dancing at a wedding. So his feet slid around a little, and they did slip from time to time, though his recoveries were always quick, calm, and smooth as can be. Once, I even noticed him briskly adjusting his tie when it had become a little tangled and loose. He was a man of little wasted motion. So, he was getting close to the 5th story and the flower pot. The crowd was becoming a little unruly, but was still pretty rah-rah about the whole thing. I'm mostly wondering what the hell the guy's going to do with the flower once he gets there. Is he going to grab the whole flower pot and climb back down with it? I mean, that would be really incredible. But also a bit dangerous. I mean, a lot more than just climb up, but probably impossible. I figured he was probably going to grab the flower and climb back down with it in his teeth. I mean, that's what I'd do if I were him. I thought it would be a pretty cool thing to do. But, I don't know, it was really hard to tell with that guy. He was so no-nonsense about everything. Maybe the person who lived in that apartment with the flower pot on the windowsill would, open the window and scream at him, "Hey, what the fuck are you doing stealing my flower?" Or something like that. And then maybe they'd let him climb in the window and make an exit down the building stairs. Maybe they wouldn't. Maybe they'd be really pissed off at him, or maybe nobody would be home. The tension was really starting to build in the crowd. Everyone was wondering what would happen next. I remember the sun was glinting off the windows, kind of getting in my eyes, and I put up my hand like a visor to shield them. But, it was hard to see. The bricks looked really pretty in that fading light, though. Everything was kind of melting into this sepia-tinged color that, it just comes around just before twilight, when the sun is fading, but, night hasn't really started in yet. The wind was picking up a bit. A few leaves were becoming unhinged from the wiry branches of sidewalk trees, and they were getting blown down into the gutter and off into the street where cars would come by and crush them into the macadam. I looked around at all the old buildings around there, a few weathered signs sprouting from their sides with cracked, unlit neon letters. I remember how distinct everything seemed, how I could separate this vision of things from anything else in the world. This way that things looked, the way it made me feel, like an old black and white photo of a bustling street scene. The way the shop awnings hung there, the unique angles that the building shapes gave to the shadows, the steepness, all the people gathered around and sticking their heads out of windows too. The way it felt to be alive just then, at that particular juncture in my life. And then, there's that no-nonsense guy, up by the 5th-story window of that building, dangling there, right by the ledge where the flower pot is. This flower pot with a daisy in it. He's up there so high, it doesn't really seem possible. We are all down here alone. He is above us, and he is just another part of this landscape. Nothing more than the protrusion of a bay window or a concrete entrance canopy with its Doric column stanchions, or a car parked on the street, or a band of pigeons rooting on a telephone wire, or a loose manhole cover clanking out of the massive wheels of a bus going by, or a clarinet leaning against the side of a garbage can, or a white pedal floating in midair, or the heavy thud of something going kerplunk on the sidewalk.